Today's topic about Russia is pretty important for Europeans. Russia is not the Christian country Europe imagines. Russia is secular on paper, Orthodox in symbols, and increasingly Islam shape in practice. Russia is Islamic state. Russia looks Orthodox Christian from the outside. This is the image Europe usually sees. But religious life in Russia is stranger than that. Just look at this. In Moscow, about 200,000 people attended Christmas services, and for it, about 500,000 Muslim men catered. I pointed the trend there for a reason. It's important for understanding that real number is larger. If Christmas is a day for everybody, then Muslim women are at home at the moment. So, in Moscow, which is European city, in fact, number of Muslims is much bigger than number of religious Christians. Those numbers do not prove that Moscow is more Muslim than Christian, but they do show something Europe often misses. Muslim public religious life in Russia is not marginal, it is massive, visible and politically important. How it turned that Russia is still considered as a Christian neighbor of Europe just because of 100 years ago the ruling dynasty was Christian, and I a Russian living in Europe, and today I want to show you something even many Europeans who follow Russia completely miss. Russia is not what its Orthodox image makes it look like. 6 EU countries share a border with Russia. That border is more than 2,500 kilometers long. It's actually the longest one. And yet, Europe often discusses Russia as if it's a simply bigger, stranger version of Eastern European Christian nation state, like Slovenia. But that is not what Russia is. Russia is multi-ethnic state. There are hundreds of cultures, languages, ethnic groups here. And we are actually quite used to living alongside one another. If you don't believe me because media tries to show you different picture, that's a separate video. And of course, it is always tempting to turn everything to numbers, right? Okay, so here's the situation. Let us say we want to count how many religious people there are. Before we even decide how to measure that, which is already not simple, we have to start with the definitions. Who exactly counts as religious? Fine, let us say it is whoever called themselves religious when a person with a clipboard stopped them on the street and asked. Yeah, very convincing. But this is only one method of measurements, as we already understand. And yet, for some reason, that is one sociological services decided they could trust. In real Russia, I am Orthodox often does not mean I am actively practicing Christianity. For many people, Orthodoxy is closer to cultural identity than religion. It means, rather, this is our history. This is who we are supposed to be, but it doesn't necessarily mean church's rules, fasting, or belief. You can know a person for years and still have no idea if they actually believe in any of gods. By polls, Russia is 67% Christian, but the real question is, Christian how? You know, Russia threw the part of it that was the monarchy. But even then, a huge share of the population was Muslim. But even if the ruling dynasty was Christian, the presence of Muslim was a normal part of Russian reality. The USSR, meanwhile, was a fairly closed society. So, what stayed in people's memory were associations with the empire instead. And when we talk about the religion of Russians today, those older imperial associations are often still doing the work. But USSR is a huge part of our history, because the Soviet Union was fundamentally a state of atheists, not just a secular state with freedom of religions, but a system that actively pushed religion out of public life. Churches were demolished, shut down, or turned into museums, warehouses, institutes, and government buildings. Priests were executed, imprisoned, or erased as a social class. And even visible signs of religiosity could get you punished. But this pressure wasn't distributed evenly. This is crucial. In the more distant and small republics, traditional ways of life often survived better, not because those places were more free, but because the Soviet system did not penetrate every region with the same intensity. In Russia, especially in its European part, many people could suddenly wear a cross again, baptize their children, talk about orthodoxy, and reclaim religious symbol as part of national tradition, but their lifestyle often remained basically atheist or agnostic. Religion came back as identity, as ritual, as culture, not necessarily as a practice. For people who had actually remained believers, faith did not come back, it simply became more visible. And that matters a lot when we talk about Muslims in Russia, because in many Muslim communities, beliefs never disappeared in the same way. It may have become more quiet, more private, more cautious under Soviet rule, but family structures, community rules, and religious habit often survived more strongly than many outsiders realize. So one way to put it in this, a large part of Russia's Christian majority was secularized by the Soviet period, while many of Russian Muslims were not secularized in the same extent. And that the second process began. After the collapse of USSR, some former republic moved as far away from Russia as possible. The Baltic states, for example, wanted to leave Russia behind like a nightmare and integrate into a completely different political and cultural world, which was closer to them than Russia. But the poorer southern post-Soviet republics remained much more closely tied to Russia, and that things where a major migration flow came from. So Russia ended up with two things at once. First, it already had a large native Muslim population on its own, and second, it began receiving a massive influx of Muslims from southern former Soviet republics. And unlike the EU, Russia's migration system for that flow was relatively easy. No visas, fewer barriers, and much more open post-Soviet space. People came to work, stayed, got documents, became citizens, brought their families, had children, and built new lives. Yes, there was also migration from Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine, but in terms of religious balance, that did not reshape Russia in the same way. So modern Russia is not just a country with Muslim minority. It is a country with its own historic Muslim population, plus a major Muslim migration flow on top of the society where a huge share of nominally Orthodox people already live in a basically secular way, and counting the religious people, only the Muslim in Russia are a majority. Okay, what is happening now and what to expect in the future? After USSR came Chechen wars. Chechnya wanted independence from Russia, and Russia refused to let it go. Usual stuff. Formally, Russia won. Chechnya remained inside in Russian Federation. But when I look at the laws changed and the rhetorics and the political direction that followed, I suspect that peace that emerged was tied not only to territory but also to values expansion itself. Because after that, the Russian state became extremely careful around Muslims. Islam in Russia was no longer just a demographic fact. It became a security fact, a political and a psychological fact for the state. Example, the law of offending believers' feelings created tons of scandals because We are a democratic country, and by the law, nobody's feeling could be offended. So why would we have that special law for religious people? People often mocked it as a law designed to protect hysterical Orthodox old ladies, but the law protects all believers, and in practice appeared that most dangerous line to cross is often the Muslim one. A good example is the case of Nikita Zhuravlev. He is from Volgograd, a completely European city of Russia, far from the North Caucasus. After burning a Quran, terrible thing, I don't support it anyway, he was not treated as just some local provocateur in secular Russian city. His case was transferred to Chechen Republic, where the case took on an entirely different symbolic meaning. The point is not that Quran burning should be defended. It should not. The point is that the case from European city becomes symbolically tied to Chechen Republic, and that tells you a lot about how power works in modern Russia. Then add geography, social structure, everyday habits, and migration policy. Islam is not some distant or foreign presence in Russia. It is built into country, territory, cities, family structures, and public life. Right now, the Kremlin is increasingly legitimizing patriarchal, religious, traditionalist model of political answer to Russia's demographic crisis. In 2025, Putin publicly praised early marriage tradition in the North Caucasus and cited Ramzan Kadyrov's family as an example. Human rights defenders warned that early marriages in the Caucasus can be tied to pressure and violence against women and girls. So when the Russian state praises these traditions, it's not simply respecting local culture. It is helping normalize a model where family, community, obedience, and birth rates are better more than female autonomy and human rights. And this logic is not limited to Caucasus. In the Ural region, which is also a European part of Russia, authorities expanded a one-off payment of 100,000 rubles to pregnant schoolgirls who register their pregnancy. It is about $1,000, yes. One-time payment for pregnancy, very big support. Officials can describe it as a support, not encouragement of teenage pregnancy, but the political signal is still obvious. The state is moving toward the worldview where a girl's value is increasingly measured through motherhood, not education, career, or personal freedom. Again, this is not Islamic law, but it is belong to the same broader turn away from liberal individual autonomy and toward patriarchy, reproduction, and state-managed traditional values. And on top of that, the Kremlin has spent years moving closer to Muslim regimes abroad, while treating Muslim loyalty inside Russia as strategically important. Taliban representatives visit our official events. Afghanistani labor migrants are going to move to Russia, and I'm not talking about long relationship with Syria, Iran, etc. And this is also where traditional values becomes important. When the Russian state praises conservative family structures in the North Caucasus or promotes policies where girls are encouraged to become mothers instead of continuing education, this is not simply about religion. It is about broader political turn away from liberal individual autonomy and toward patriarchy, obedience, birth rates, and community control. So the trend is pretty clear: more visibility, more influence, more caution, and more accommodation. Okay, now we know that Russia is not a Christian country, but rather the Islamic one. And now we just need to consider the reality and should be less naive. National problems in Europe and in Russia are very different, and Russia doesn't have nationalism or racism in European meaning. 100 years ago, the population of Russians in Russia was 44%. it is less than half, and we train to be friendly to other cultures. This is where Russian question becomes a European problem. Take the recent PASA case. European institutions decided that there had to be a Chechen representative. But why especially a Chechen? And not Buryat, for example, or Mansi, who are even presented in Central Europe? Stereotypes, possibly. What should we do with them? And if the goal was real inclusion, why assume that a Chechen man is the vulnerable figure in that story? In Russia, the Chechen people in the most vulnerable position are women and gays, not a regular man who has all the benefits from oppression others. That contradiction became obvious pretty quickly. Ruslan Kutayev, Chechen activist, included in the PASE platform of Russian Democratic Forces under a quota for the indigenous people of Russia came under calls for removal after remarks defending so-called honor punishment and saying that families had the right to decide a person's fate. If you don't know what is that, it is about the role that men are responsible for women's sins, and the only way how man could be cleaned in God's eyes is to the woman run away from home, from beating and abuse, have a friendship with a gay, to be disagreed to marry some unknown person, even if you are 12. All that is enough reason to be punished once and forever. So, Russian Democratic Platform of PASE activists who was invited to defend oppressed Russians say that it is a tradition and our women are our and it couldn't be discussed. North Caucasus rights group that appealed to PASE, arguing that someone justifying such violence could not represent platforms supposedly built around democracy and human rights. But lack of information about real Russia makes such things invisible. So this is a problem. Europe applies its own categories to a reality it does not understand and ends up empowering the wrong people. Symbolic ethnic representation without understanding the actual social structure can be not just irrelevant but even harmful. And this is also why I think one more point has to be said clearly. If you actually care about vulnerable people in this system, then women deserve far more attention than male representatives of so-called minorities, who may themselves reproduce that oppression. In places like Chechen Republic, women are often ones who most urgently need the protection. There is also a security dimension. The North Caucasus has produced jihadist network ISIS-linked fighters and returning militants. This does not mean every Chechen, every Muslim, or every migrant is dangerous. That would be false and immoral. That would be false and immoral, but it does mean Europe should understand the risks with precision, not through stereotypes and not through naive symbolic politics. Russia is not like Slovenia, just bigger. It is not normal European nation state scaled up on the map. The key word is to remember to not be so naive thinking that Russia is mentally European nation. Average Russian male man, even from Moscow, is rather full of Saudi values than European, so better to be careful with them. If Europe ignores that complexity, it will misunderstand both the risks and the people who most need the protection. So Russia is not a European country, it's a different historical organism with different religious balance, social hierarchies and different risks. And if you misunderstand that reality, you will not help the vulnerable. But don't be sad, watch my another video about Russian version of Wild West, that's much more fun. Share your thoughts and comments and see you.